Good morning, and welcome to GSBA's Rapid Response, giving you the opportunity to ask questions with live answers. A Rapid Response is GSBA's webinar series designed to provide you with expert support, information, and industry insights as needed. Today, our immediate feedback comes directly from Sarah House, Director and Senior Economist for Wells Fargo's Corporate and Investment Bank. My name is Joey Chapman. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Membership Development Manager with GSBA. After a year of uncertainty, we are all looking forward to some answers when it comes time to what to expect from our economy in recovery. GSBA is proud to welcome Sarah House, sharing what to look for following the COVID-19 economic crisis. For this rapid response, we are going to welcome Roby Schapira, Diverse Segments Leader, Small Business at Wells Fargo and Company, and GSBA Board Member, who will lead our discussion. But first, how will our rapid response work for you? We are streaming both live on Facebook and, of course, on Zoom. Throughout the hour, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the Q&A features. Our GSBA team will be following along both on Zoom and Facebook in order to grab those questions, and we can make sure they're presented to our panel today. Now, please go ahead and welcome today's GSBA Rapid Response moderator, Roby Schapira.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's 10 o'clock. Good morning and happy Pride. Roby Schapira. My pronouns are he, him, his, and happy Pride and happy Pride. Happy June, everyone. Thank you for joining. This idea for today's rapid response actually came from some of our GSBA members who were talking to me about just how powerful and how wonderful it would be to get an expert like Sarah to join us and to share firsthand. And like Joey said, one of the great things about rapid response is your opportunity to ask questions about things that are changing so often in the economy and with jobs, employment, small business. And what's fantastic about my good friend and colleague, Sarah House, is that Sarah is going to share not just a national perspective, but also give us some regional perspective on the state of Washington. So if you're watching from outside of Washington, you'll get some great national info. And then if you're local at the moment, you'll get some good regional information too. As Joey shared, I'm also a proud GSBA board member, but I lead our diverse segment work for small business at Wells Fargo across the country. And I'm really proud to bring Sarah to this table, this forum. Sarah is, as Joey shared, one of our senior economists. And so an opportunity for someone who literally every day is looking at information and helping not just Wells Fargo to make great decisions, but speaking on behalf of the bank. Sarah's got an incredible amount of experience from CNBC to NPR, but also just helping, in forums like this one to spread and share information to help business owners and community leaders to have some insight into the world of economics and what's going on in our economy. So, Sarah, welcome. Thank you for joining us for the GSBA Rapid Response. And I know you're going to share your window in a moment, but just a huge thank you for coming and bringing your insights to us today.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be with you all and talk a little bit about the economy as we head into really what's a new phase of this episode from the pandemic. So as Roby said, I'm a senior economist with Wells Fargo. Pronouns I use are she, her, hers, and very, very excited to share the outlook with you today. So when it comes to where we are in this recovery, I think we are entering a really important time and a really exciting time. So there's still a lot of tailwinds to growth that we've seen. The health picture is obviously getting better, and we've had tremendous fiscal support this cycle, which has made a huge difference. But when we look at the economy right now, as well as the outlook, we're seeing some pretty interesting dynamics. So one, we're still seeing some bifurcation where some industries industries remain exceptionally hard hit. Others are doing really well in this environment. At the same time, there's tremendous frictions as we try to reopen the economy. And there's a lot of questions over whether all the policy support we see, the fiscal, the monetary, whether it's too much and whether we might have some adverse effects, such as inflation. And so we'll talk about all those factors, as well as check in on how Washington's economy has done as well. So starting out and looking at our overall forecast. So we are at a period where the health picture has improved rapidly. So we now have 63% of adults that have at least one vaccine in them. We're seeing cases of COVID plummet, and we're seeing restrictions ease. At the same time, we've seen tremendous fiscal support, including another round towards the end of March. And so what we've seen is really a potent combination between the health and the fiscal picture in recent months, which has led to growth picking up. So we're expecting GDP growth here in the second quarter to increase at roughly a 10% annualized rate. For the year overall, we're looking for the economy to expand 7%. So to put that in perspective, that would be the fastest growth we've seen since 1984. And you might think, well, the economy and output collapsed so much, it's due for a pretty big comeback, and that's true. But I'd also point out that the speed of this recovery has been tremendous. So this has really been a V-shaped recovery. We took a little bit of a pause there in the winter, but we estimate that the economy has already gone back to the level of output that we saw prior to COVID in the current quarter. And in some ways, what's even more remarkable is just the speed of growth as we look out over the course of the year. So we're looking for GDP growth to remain mid to high single digits. And that means that not only are we already back to where we were prior to COVID, but we're also back to where we would have been. So economists like to call this the output gap. And what that basically means is that the economy is more or less running full tilt. And we're certainly seeing that with some of the supply chain strains that we're seeing, and basically, in some ways, business and output not growing as fast as it could be because it's constrained by the economy's overall capacity. So overall, this remains a pretty rapid recovery, but of course, it hasn't been even, depending on industry, types of workers, big business, small business, et cetera. Now, as we look ahead, as I mentioned, we're still pretty optimistic about growth. So this is just more than bounce off the bottom. We are looking at a pretty strong environment for the U.S. over the next year and a half or so. And a part of that has to do with the fiscal response that we have seen in this particular crisis. The fiscal response really cannot be overstated in terms of how forceful and how important it is to the outlook. So we've had in total 7 rounds of COVID relief, some deals much bigger than others. But if you add them up, they equate to roughly 24% of the US economy. Now, that compares to GDP only contracting by 10%. So in other words, the fiscal response has been overwhelming in this current period. Now, one thing that marks a big difference between what we saw between 2008 and 2010 and the fiscal support then is not only is it much larger. So policymakers were determined not to be too timid and to make sure we didn't get a degree of scarring like we saw in the last cycle that really slowed growth for the better part of the past decade. And what we've seen is that a lot of the support has gone directly to businesses and households. So this compares to 2008, 2009 crisis, when a lot of the relief went to recapitalizing the banking system, which was needed given that the nature of that crisis was a financial crisis. But in this case, we've seen money flow directly into the economy. So you can see the various rounds of major stimulus efforts here. And what we've seen is a surge in overall personal income. So we only saw 1 month in this entire period where personal income was actually below its pre-COVID rate. And I should say that personal income includes income from labor, so wages, supplements to wages, things like benefits, but it also includes things like proprietor's income, rental income, that sort of thing. So it does include small business income as well. And so you can see that we've seen tremendous strength in terms of that income profile, which is setting up households to continue spending at a pretty strong rate. And that's important given that consumers are, of course, the backbone of the American economy. Now, when we look at the outlook for spending, so yes, we expect a moderation here in the coming months as we get further away from that initial fiscal impulse and just that initial burst of activity as we come out of all these restrictions and it's finally safe and the weather's conducive to going out and doing some of the social activities that we've been putting off for the better part of the past year. But we expect that spending is going to remain remarkably strong even beyond this summer. And that has to do with household finances. So given the fiscal support that we've seen, and along with the fact that we couldn't do many of the things that we liked over the past year, we couldn't travel, we couldn't go out and eat at restaurants. What we've seen is households have saved a lot more than they would have otherwise over the past 15 months or so. And when you total up all that additional saving above and beyond what the household sector would have stashed away, you get excess savings of roughly $2.3 trillion. So to put that in perspective, that's about 15% of what consumers would spend in a year. So there's still tremendous force behind the position of consumers. Now, you couple that with much stronger balance sheets. So in some ways, not all of this money is sitting around waiting to be immediately spent. Some of it's been used to pay down debt. Maybe it's been used to put more money into retirement accounts. But what we end up with is overall a much stronger balance sheet among households. And this marks a big difference from the last crisis when you had housing values decline, you had a much bigger and more persistent decline in financial markets. And so you saw wealth really take a hit and households had to delever. They had taken on too much debt prior to that period. This was not the case this time at all. Household balance sheets were actually already very strong going into this episode, and they've come out even stronger thanks to very supportive monetary policy, which has helped stabilize financial markets. And of course, a big boom in housing as we've seen really people rethink how much they're willing to spend on their housing situation as we have had to social distance. And so that's lifted prices as well. So in other words, this is not a balance sheet recession. So balance sheet recessions tend to be much longer, slower, and more protracted than your run-of-the-mill recessions caused by some exogenous shock versus the imbalance that occurs with balance sheets recessions. Now, we've also seen a pretty big reorientation in spending. So this is in part what we're having to contend with as we look ahead, and causing some of the frictions that we're seeing right now is that we've seen a tremendous surge in spending on goods, so particularly durable goods. Now, typically, durable goods are the area of spending that take the biggest hit in a recession. They're the slowest to come back because, again, these are long-lasting items. Usually, they're pretty big ticket items. So think cars, SUVs. Think your RVs, your household appliances, and so a lot of those decisions can be put off. But here where we've had to social distance, and again, we can't go out and do maybe some of the fun experience spending that we were doing prior to COVID, you've seen a lot of that money shift towards goods. And so durable goods spending in particular has taken off, and even non-durable goods spending has done pretty well, whereas we're still not back to where we were with services. So this is being held down particularly by travel services, to some degree, restaurant spending, but also even some discretionary healthcare decisions have been put off. Now, looking ahead, we expect service spending to strengthen and really drive consumer spending in the months to come. So it's not to say that goods spending is about to collapse. So while some demand may have been pulled forward, I think the strong position of household finances overall support continued strength in goods spending. And when you look at even where we are in how much goods spending increases over a typical cycle, there's still room to run. It's just unlikely to run at the impressive pace that we've seen over the past year. Now, as we've seen such strong goods spending, and again, it's not like households and consumers are begging off from many of those auto purchases, for example, anytime yet, you have seen a big depletion in inventories. So inventories, particularly at the retail level, so these finished goods, we've seen those collapse to the lowest level versus sales in history. So basically, inventories have been depleted, and businesses can't even fully meet demand. So sales could be even stronger if there was the product there to sell. As we look at supply chains, we're seeing increased delivery times. So manufacturing delivery times have increased at the fastest pace going back to the early 1970s. We're seeing a similar pattern bear out in the service sectors. And this really comes down to the fact that manufacturers, they can't get parts, they can't get materials. So it's either clogged up in global supply chains that either are having trouble meeting orders given this global surge in goods spending. Other countries might be dealing with COVID outbreaks, which is limiting production. US manufacturers are still having trouble luring back workers, which we'll talk about here shortly. And so all of that comes down to businesses can't fully meet demand right now. Now, as I mentioned, part of this is a labor issue. So we've seen businesses reopen pretty quickly, but it seems labor is taking more time to come back. So as you can see on this left-hand side chart, so the share of small businesses reporting that they have at least one job opening hard to fill has skyrocketed to a record high. So this is the highest level that we have since records going back to, again, the early 1970s. And that comes as we just haven't seen labor return in any real shape or form over the past few months. So we saw an initial bounce off the bottom as we came out of those initial spring lockdowns, but really we've seen participation among prime age workers. So this is workers aged 25 to 54-year-olds, and really just strips out the demographic effects of things like retirements as you get an aging population. And we've seen workers slow to come back for a number of reasons. So, it's a combination of health concerns, it's childcare, it's the fact that you do have some pretty generous unemployment insurance benefits. But I think also part of this is just the sheer speed of reopening. So, there's essentially a little bit of whiplash going on where, look, we've just been told to stay home and avoid people for so long. And it's taking some time to go out and feel safe again. And it's hard for businesses all to hire immediately at once. So there's a lot to sift through in that. So we think employment growth will pick up somewhat here in the months ahead, but it's going to take time to see the labor market recover. In the meantime, though, we are seeing wage pressures emerge as businesses are having trouble getting those workers to return to the job site for whatever their particular reason or combination of reasons might be. So you can see here on the right-hand side chart, the employment cost index has turned higher again. So in the first quarter, we saw the biggest single quarter of growth in about 14 years. If we look at a different measure of wages, so the average hourly earnings numbers that come from the monthly employment report, well, those don't control for composition the same way this employment cost index. But if you look across different industries, you're seeing widespread gains in wages, particularly in lower paying industries that are in person and have had the hardest time getting workers back to the job site. So for example, in the leisure and hospitality sector, where you still have about 2.5 million fewer jobs, you're seeing wages increase at a 17% annualized rate the past 3 months. So workers are taking a little bit of coaxing in terms of pay to come back, and that's still not addressing fully the shortages. And so when we look at the small business sector, so we saw in May's report, optimism dipped for the first time in 4 months. And that's because businesses have some new headaches to contend with. So sales might be looking up, but when we look at other issues firms are dealing with, so labor has become an increasing challenge. So if we look at the number one most important problem listed by small businesses, labor has become the most frequently cited, even ahead of taxes and regulations, which is kind of the perennial favorite in that sector. I'd also point out, though, that we are seeing a pretty notable, even though it's still not the most frequently cited number one problem, but we have seen a notable pickup in inflation concerns. So this comes as we're seeing really costs rise across supply chain. So whether that's for materials, whether it's food input costs if you're a restaurant. But also, of course, the wage pressures that were emerging as, again, it's taking longer for workers to come back to the workforce than businesses are ready to hire. And when we look at inflation, we certainly have seen a notable pickup in price growth. So the overall consumer price index at 4.2% is the highest we've seen since 2008. So if you remember back then, we were seeing oil prices soaring, hitting $150 a barrel. Today's increase in prices is more widespread than that. It's not just energy, but we're seeing it in non-commodity areas as well. So if you look at the core consumer price index, so that strips out food and energy because those tend to be very volatile sectors, as well as sectors that monetary policymakers don't have a lot of control over in the short run, you're seeing inflation up 3% over the past year, which is actually the strongest rate since the mid-1990s. So there's definitely more inflationary pressures. The historical difference is a little bit different depending on what measure you use. But bottom line is we certainly are seeing more price pressures emerging. Now, how worried might the Fed be about this, or how worried should you as a business owner be worried about widespread, rampant price increases signaled by some of the latest inflation data? Well, I'd still say we're not worried about inflation taking off on more of a sustained basis and seeing a wage price spiral akin to what we saw back in the 1970s or early 1980s. So we are seeing notable strength in inflation. So this looks just at the monthly change in inflation. You can see this is not just merely base effects. We're comparing these figures to last April when we saw prices decline across a wide array of goods. It's partly that, but we are seeing an acceleration just over the past couple months. But take a look at the components here. So some of the areas to see the biggest contributions include travel services. So this is things like rental cars, hotels, airplane tickets. And together, these only account for 1.5% of the CPI basket. But with each of these categories growing more than 10% over the past month, it's added roughly 20% to the contribution. Similarly, we've seen vehicles. So vehicle prices, particularly in the used market, shot up 10% last month. And so that added a significant share, even though vehicles in total only make up 6.5% of the index. But that comes down to some unique supply chain issues related to the auto sector. Basically, that the auto producers were very eager to cut orders for parts come the downturn, and not expecting that we'd see such robust demand for other electronics. And so they've been hit particularly hard by the semiconductor shortages. So in other words, there are some idiosyncratic, kind of unique one-off factors that have been pushing up inflation more recently. We don't think that these factors have completely worked themselves out, and we think that we will see another couple months of very strong monthly inflation readings that will show up in terms of elevated inflation over the next year or so. To be more specific about that, we're expecting CPI growth of probably somewhere around 4.5% to 5% between now and the end of the year. But in order for inflation to really take hold, you need to see these sorts of price gains month in, month out for a prolonged period. And so we need to see essentially these unique one-off factors repeat in some way, shape, or form a year out from now, or even 2 years out for inflation really, really to take hold. We don't expect that. We don't expect that to happen, and we suspect inflation will begin to subside in early 2022. Now, the one caveat to that is watch what happens to inflation expectations. So if workers and businesses really believe that inflation is going to take hold, businesses are going to raise prices in anticipation of higher wage costs. Workers are going to push for higher wages in anticipation of higher living costs. And so you can get into this vicious cycle of inflation. Now, we have seen a notable increase in inflation expectations more recently. It's not unprecedented. We've seen them rise in a similar vein, only to come quickly back down. But there is a difference in that the Fed is actually trying to get a little bit more inflation in this economy. They want to see inflation expectations move somewhat higher. And so this is a little bit of uncharted territory where the Fed has ushered out a more patient framework, which basically says we're going to let the economy run hotter than we would have otherwise. We're okay with more inflation than we would see otherwise, in an effort to help get inflation closer to its target on a sustained, prolonged basis. Since over the past decade, inflation basically fell short of their target and took inflation expectations down with it. Now, another reason that the Fed is going to remain patient is not just that they've adopted this flexible average inflation targeting, which again basically means they're going to let inflation go above their 2% target for a time, but really the Fed has put more emphasis on the labor side of its mandate. So the Fed really took to heart in the last cycle that they were a little bit slower to raise rates than people projected. At one point, they even raised rates thinking that inflation was going to come, and it never did. And they saw by taking a more patient approach how you could benefit particularly more marginalized groups in the economy. And basically, you could get an even stronger labor market without setting off inflation. And so with that in mind, the Fed is looking at the current state of the labor market. And yes, from the perspective of businesses, a lot of them are having trouble hiring at this point. But they're still looking at the fact that we have a pretty significant jobs deficit relative to where we were before COVID. So in total, the US economy is still 7.6 million jobs short. That's about 5%. Job losses, not that much better than the worst point of the Great Recession. And so the Fed's taking a more patient approach, knowing that, yes, we're seeing some inflation pressures now as we have some of these supply bottlenecks. Some sectors are reopening and have room to push prices back closer to where they would have been prior to COVID. But it's going to be hard to get sustained inflationary pressures if you have such a large segment of your population still not working over the next year or two. Now, another factor related to that is just again looking at the Fed is also more concerned about the composition of the workforce and the composition of employment. And so this just goes to illustrate too that we've seen lower paid workers hardest hit by this downturn. And that's something that's not lost on the Fed. So they want to make sure that those workers have those workers have a chance to benefit from a strong, arguably hot jobs market. And so that's something that the Fed is keeping an eye on as well. Now, bringing it over to Washington and taking a look at how trends in Washington stack up to what we're seeing in the U.S. So you can see that we've had activity really take off since the spring, similar to the U.S. So if you look at some of the high frequency data like mobility, visits to retail and recreation locations, so these are more discretionary in-person type of visits, you can see that we really hit a turning point in early March when you started to see vaccinations become widely available. You had the combination of better weather, and of course you had fiscal stimulus as well. Now, we're not quite back to where we were, what that pre-COVID baseline is, but pretty darn close. And you can definitely see that activity has picked up to a significant degree.
Hey, Sarah, before we go on, do you mind if we hit some of the themes nationally, and then we can, since you're about to make that transition to Washington, and if you don't mind, would you jump back to the employment, the one that graphed the 2008-2009 Great Recession against the 2020 crisis? I think it's your slide 13. Yeah, so it's interesting, but I imagine what's on the mind of most of our group that are listening are small business owners is, when is some of this going to change? And what I really appreciated about this graph is it starts us at the beginning, and it even shows us before the Great Recession, before the COVID-19 crisis. And here we are just about, a year past. So where that dotted line starts, I'm imagining the bottom axis is years since the beginning. Is that what that x-axis is? Mm-hmm. So we're about a year into COVID-19, and you're projecting an extraordinary, not just you, but Wells Fargo, we're projecting an extraordinary rebound in jobs. How much is that impacted by, there are jobs available, but to your point, people aren't taking them for a multitude of reasons. Do you think this is somewhat people getting back to work, or do you think this is businesses rebounding, or is it both?
It's going to be both. So I should say, so this is as of our May forecast. So we've had more employment data come in, including the May jobs report last Friday. And what that and the April jobs report showed is that there's more of a speed limit to hiring than I think we and a lot of other economists were generally appreciating. And so I would say that with that in mind, that the jobs recovery is going to be a little bit more protracted than what we see here. So probably not getting back the jobs we lost until maybe very early 2023, never mind the jobs we should have been creating. But I do think that we'll probably see, if not necessarily a pickup in the next couple months, I do think that we'll see labor constraints ease, and that you should continue to see job gains in this roughly 500,000 pace that we saw here with the May jobs data. And that's because there are signs of the biggest factors holding back workers beginning to fade. So take health concerns, for example. So over the past month, according to a special survey that the Census Bureau has been doing ever since COVID started, they've been doing about every 2 to 3 weeks, you see about 1 million fewer people reporting that they are not looking for work right now because they're either afraid of getting COVID, they're sick themselves with COVID-like symptoms, or caring for someone else. So those health concerns are going to abate. At the same time, for all the political controversy of these extra unemployment insurance benefits, they are set to expire in early September across the country. But as I'm sure everyone's heard, about half of states have decided to end them early. So we'll see those begin to end at the end of June for some states through July. It'll probably take us till about August to really see that in the data. But that's a constraint that's going to fade. At the same time, the school situation. So if you look at what's happened in terms of the dropout rate for mothers of school-age children, it's more than twice the overall decline in participation. So once we get kids back to hopefully in-person full-time learning, that's going to allow some women to transition back to the labor force. And so it's going to take some time for these to ease, but we think, come the fall, you could see a notable increase in supply, which could help the overall pace of hiring. But really that those last couple millions of jobs are going to take more time to recover. So we've seen a big reorientation in spending. We think, some people aren't going to want to go back to the old jobs. We're going to see new jobs be created, and that's going to take time for these matches and these skills to match up. And so it's going to take time. And that's why you see the slope of this change as we get further out.
So great. Thank you, Sarah. A couple of questions came in while you were talking, and this is a different shock to the system than we've seen before, because it literally involves, mortality of people dying. And so I'm curious, as economists are forecasting things like economic recovery and employment change, are they taking into account at all just the labor workforce impacts of those that have died, and perhaps even looking at certain things like the inequity of COVID impacts by industry or role? And the example that the question asker gave was because there are higher fatality rates amongst, as an example, low-wage essential workers.
Yeah, so I think that certainly has been a constraint to bringing workers back into the labor force, as particularly as we see wages rise across these low-wage sectors. It's because there's a lot of considerations given that this is a healthcare crisis, and that many of those jobs are in person. And so they did pose the greatest health risks. And so I think that's why you've seen a particular issue in getting those jobs filled right now. I think in terms of the overall, given that, again, we did have a lot of fatalities and that this was a healthcare crisis, I don't see that having a major impact in terms of the outlook, because as I'm sure everyone's familiar with, this did hit elderly people much more significantly than it did more of your working age population. That said, there is a group that's kind of on the bubble. So those that were close to retirement age, and we have seen an acceleration in retirements. And so that is going to be one component of the labor force that we don't think is going to just come back. So that we think a lot of those retirements will be more or less permanent, especially when you consider the financial backdrop. Again, this is not 2008 where 401ks got pummeled. Homeowners still have a lot of equity and value in their homes, and so I think that's one segment that will be slower to come back. So that'll weigh on the overall recovery, but I don't think that the fatality portion itself is going to be a huge factor.
Yeah, it's great commentary. Thanks, Sarah. And some of this being, when we look at it nationally, obviously the number of fatalities gets smaller and smaller as a percentage. But I think I really appreciate the question asker, because you may be seeing in your industry or in your community, higher levels. And so that's where industry specific and even regionally specific, may have greater impacts. There's one more question in it, and it goes to immigration impact on employment, and specifically programs like EB-3, employment-based immigration. Any commentary on, perhaps with a new administration and new perspective and legislation around immigration, any impacts that you would comment on, Sarah?
Yeah, so I'd say that immigration has also been a big part of these labor constraints right now, is the fact that we haven't allowed as many workers in, particularly, again, for some of those low-paying jobs that, let's face it, a lot of Americans do not want to do. And so that's been a limiting factor to hiring and overall growth, and really thrown a wrench into a lot of industries, and again, been another source of inflation pressures. I think, there is some, given that this administration is friendlier towards immigration, I think that could help alleviate the situation. But at the same time, in some ways it depends on how well we're doing controlling the virus. Right now it looks pretty good, but if you rewind back 6 to 9 months ago, a lot of immigrants didn't want to come for fear of the health situation. So it's going to depend on a lot of different factors as we go ahead.
Yeah, that's great. And I know there was a request for help. And by the way, it came from Marty Hopper, who recommended the session. So thank you, Marty. And so I imagine the GSBA will follow up on that request. But Sarah, I think to your point, why don't we jump and look at some of the Washington specifics to make sure you have time to go through that. And I do note that we have another question, some on costs and small business, but we'll catch that in the wrap up if you want to move to the Washington data.
Okay, yeah, we'll go through the Washington data real quick and then wrap up with inflation, which is one of my favorite topics, period, but especially right now, plenty going on. All right, so here this is just a comparison between how Washington is doing with the rest of the country in terms of seeing that jobs recovery. So more or less the middle of the pack, maybe a little bit worse than what the U.S. is doing in terms of number of jobs recovered from the downturn. But when we look at momentum in Washington itself, it is improving. So you can see that. You can see that employment growth, like the nation, it has accelerated over the past 3 months or so. So whether you measure it by, depending on what measure of household survey or non-farm payrolls, these are just two ways of counting either jobs or number of people who report having a job. But the bottom line is the recovery is underway. And in fact, if you look at where Washington is in terms of overall job losses relative to before COVID, it's been more modest. So whereas in April, overall employment in the United States was down 5.5%. It was only down, take only how you will, but it was only down at 4.8%. So relatively more modest. Now, when you look at this chart on the right here, so this is looking at job growth by industry over the past year, but there's a 3-month moving average on it. So really what this is looking at is the average level of employment between February and April 2021, comparing it to February through April of 2020. So really just kind of the height of the pandemic and when we really began to see lockdowns and the labor market suffer. And what you can see here is that overall job growth in Washington is still down relative to that period, but you are seeing areas of strength that I think that have emerged since the pandemic and are relatively, more obvious in this chart. So not surprisingly, given all the spending we've seen on goods. So that's helped retail employment, it's helped wholesale employment, and it's really helped transportation employment. So one of the areas we're seeing the biggest shortages is in things like truck drivers. If you look at ports across the globe. So you're having trouble getting containers, you're having trouble getting docking space. And so really the transportation sector has been running full tilt as well. Manufacturing has been, even though that's been goods has been generally an area of strength, and the fact that a lot of manufacturers can't get those parts and they're actually having trouble finding workers has held down manufacturing employment. This has been a bigger issue in Washington, just given the presence of Boeing and how many workers they employ, and that there's, even as we've seen the 737 MAX cleared to fly, there's still some lingering production holdbacks there. And, like many other parts of the country, the leisure and hospitality sector still has a long road to coverage. Meanwhile, though, construction employment doing pretty well. So a lot of this comes from housing, as well as just some movement in terms of non-residential construction. And then information. So this is the smallest industry that's true across the U.S., but this is where, your data service provider, so Amazon Web Services, Microsoft, all fall into this. And, these are industries that are very conducive to working from home. And I think this is in part why Washington employment has held up better overall, is that mix of industry has been a little bit more conducive to work from home. Now, taking a look at the housing market, so like the nation, it's been hot. So we've seen home prices really ratchet significantly higher, so up 17% over the past year. And that's coming as there's just really no inventory out there. So people have had a rethink in how they view housing. The downtown or more urban lifestyle hasn't been as fruitful when a lot of restaurants are closed and people aren't socializing as much. And so we've seen a shift and really an acceleration in the push towards purchases, and supply's been slow to meet that demand. So we really haven't seen that much of an increase in terms of new construction. So we have to some extent, but multifamily more or less moving flat. So that's your apartments, and then your single family. It's really only been more recently. Construction in general, they're dealing with, like a lot of other folks, much higher material costs. Everything from lumber to copper. To gypsum and appliances that go in new houses. Prices have gone up there, and so that's led builders to delay how much they're building and just kind of take a pretty cautious pace to that new construction. And so with that little inventory and this growing premium on ownership or on increased space, you've seen home prices really take off. Lower mortgage rates are, of course, a part of that higher home price story as well. Now, as we think more just medium to longer term for the area, so I think Washington definitely has some growing pains, in part related to the affordability around housing. I think there's been some significant bifurcation if you again think of the work from home industries and those workers and how they fared through the pandemic versus your lower wage, more in-person service providers. But when we look at what are some longer term drivers of growth, so part of that's capital investment, part of that's productivity, which given Washington and Seattle's in particular strength in tech sector, that all benefits very well. But with that, we've seen very strong population growth, particularly when it comes to in-migration. So that's that's the blue and red line. So this is the net number of people moving into Washington versus moving out. And then, you throw on your natural increase on top of that. And while it's slowed pre-pandemic, particularly as there were some affordability issues, I think in the area, it remains overall very strong. And so that's going to support growth going forward. So prior to COVID, Washington was growing about 1.5 to 2 times the pace of the US. And with these favorable demographic trends, and again, I think the industry structure of Washington, it all remains very favorable to strong growth the remainder of this year, but more generally as we look out beyond just the immediate post-COVID period. So with that, I will go ahead and turn things back over to Robbie, and hopefully you guys have a few more questions for me.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. And it was interesting on that last slide, just the impact from immigration. I didn't turn on my video, sorry. Video, there it goes. The impact on immigration, and I know the data is a little old, it's pre-COVID data, but that'll be one to watch, especially if we start to see post-COVID people, starting to feel more comfortable. It's interesting because one of the COVID trends, just word of mouth was, is how many people are moving, and to your point, buying new homes. And I think there just was a hyper focus on, if I can't leave, if I can't socialize, I want to be somewhere better. And so it's interesting. Before we jump to inflation and ask a question there, I'm just curious on your perspective on, there's a lot of discussion with this very rapid recovery that we're, coming up to a bunch of different cliffs. There's the foreclosure cliff, all the stays on, rent evictions. Are economists forecasting that perhaps this quick, rebound is about to fall off, and could it, push us into a negative period in the economy? Just what are you hearing? What are you thinking around that perspective?
Sure. So I don't want to dismiss those concerns or minimize those concerns, because for a segment of the population, they are coming up against some very tough economic times and circumstances. That said, when I take a step back and look at the aggregate economy and think about, the rental eviction impact or potential for foreclosures, and even the expiration of these additional unemployment insurance benefits, relatively speaking, they're not large enough, I think, to really move to really knock the train off the tracks in terms of this robust recovery. I think, one of the awful things about this downturn has been that workers who were the lowest paid, could least afford to lose their jobs, lost them disproportionately. But at the same time, when we step back and we look at the impact to aggregate spending, those workers just don't make up as, the workers who held on to their jobs make up an outsized share of spending. And that actually helps the speed of recovery because those folks can continue to spend. That does help job creation for those other workers. And so, that's somewhat of a silver lining. It's cold comfort if you or your close friends or family are one of those. But, when we look at the expiration of the unemployment insurance benefits, for example, that's probably going to knock off about 0.5% from personal income growth the month that hits. Well, overall personal income, I'm going to cheat here. I think it's up about 12% above its pre-recession peak. So again, your overall income picture still looks very strong. When it comes to the housing market, so I know there's been a lot of questions with home prices. Are we in another bubble? Could we have another foreclosure crisis looming? But basically, the buyers in this market have been much higher credit. This is not subprime driven, and so So we're not expecting a foreclosure wave there. And to the extent that we do see some foreclosures, there's so much demand. And again, inventories are at all-time low. We see that those properties could get snapped up relatively quickly. This is not going to be a repeat of 2008, 2009.
Yeah, it's such a great point. So just to reemphasize a few things, it becomes another conversation about disparity and, communities within our communities that will be harder hit than others. But when you aggregate it up, what happens at the national level or even at the Washington or maybe even at the, I live in West Seattle, at the Seattle level, we start to see some of those changes, like Sarah was saying, unemployment benefits maybe shaving off 0.5% of a 12% increase, pre the COVID environment. And so it also speaks to, I think a lot of the work that we have to do in our community and that the GSBA does, to support, the segments of our community, in particular, our diverse communities that might be more heavily impacted. The question on inflation, Sarah, I don't know if you feel free to move the slides, but it's a question around inflation, as you shared, had impacted certain things more than others. And this participant, attendee, is specifically speaking to shipping costs being one of the places that they've seen much higher increases in price. And the question is there any forecast about when some of those, costs will start to level off and when we'll start to see, maybe more normal or more across the board inflation versus this very sector-based inflation?
Sure. So with regard to shipping costs, so we've certainly seen those rise rapidly. I think, if you look at, there's one index looking at container shipping rates from China. Those are up 300% since the pandemic. That's if you can even get your stuff on board. And so we've certainly seen that. If you look at some of the other measures using the producer price index, so those intermediate costs for transportation, I think have risen somewhere around 11 or 12% over the past year. So that's still, when you think about by the time it takes for that U.S. business, that's a sizable increase, especially for smaller businesses where you're probably not operating on the same margins that larger businesses that have that economy of scale have. So when it comes to what sort of relief do we have for transportation costs? So I think it's coming. So I think it's going to in part come from the fact that goods spending, well, again, we expect it to remain strong. It's not going to be growing at the pace that we've seen in recent months. Just again, we're going to see a shift in spending towards services. And some of that goods purchases have been satiated. So we'll probably, So we'll probably see a slower pace of growth in that demand. At the same time, you are seeing companies ramp up capacity to the extent that they can. So that's going to offer some help as well. And to the extent that we see COVID get under better control globally, that's going to free up some of these, port stoppages that happen here and there, like we saw out of China yesterday, announcing that I think it's the fourth busiest container port in the world. Well, that's more or less closed down because of an outbreak. So that's going to help but it is going to take time. But we see some relief on the way, but it doesn't mean that transportation costs are going to be going back down anytime soon. They're just likely to not be increasing as much over the rest of the year.
Yeah.
Probably not the best news, but
it's not that it may take some time, but it is a forecast for a reason. I mean, there's lots of factors, and one of them being that we have to, the virus has to continue to see decline in new cases because of how that impacts and is such a shock.
Yeah, and not just here, globally.
Yeah, globally. With only a few minutes left, if you were a small business owner, what would be some of the key lessons or key highlights from what you've shared today, things that you would want this group to just think about or to plan ahead for the next, year or 6 months or so?
Yeah, so I would think one, while we're on inflation, is that just understanding the burst of inflation that we're seeing, it's due to some pretty unique factors. And so just because we're seeing 4.5% inflation this year doesn't mean that we'll see 4.5% inflation next year. I think similarly, we look at what's keeping people out of the workforce right now. I think there's good reason to expect a lot of those headwinds to abate, and for the current hiring crunch that we're seeing right now, not be more severe over the second half of the year. But with that in mind, I mean, if respondents or participants are comfortable sharing some comments and kind of what they're seeing, what they're most worried about, I'd love to hear it from, my own, to get a better sense of, what businesses are facing as we think about how that might relate to some of the overall challenges that we're seeing in the economy and how that impacts growth.
Yeah, that's so great, Sarah. Well, they are not on video where they can show you how much they appreciate your time today, but I just want, on behalf of, I'm sure, some very excited and grateful attendees and participants, thank you so much. A couple things. Sarah's presentation, she always builds it so that it can be shared. So I know that Joey will be posting and probably will say something about that in a minute. And if you enjoyed the time today, if you would share some comments back to Sarah's point, one of the best things that we can give back to Sarah is just some examples and some specific feedback. What is it like for you as a business owner? There's a great article I just saw Justin Nelson post from the NGLCC about LGBTQ business. Potentially 80% will recover by 2022. So there's lots of great information, but it's great to hear directly from business owners. So Sarah, just thank you again for joining today. It was such a pleasure as always.
Thanks for having me.